Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay, and you are listening to the New Discourses podcast, and it's time we go back and finish the long-promised other part of my miniature series on the Communist Manifesto. So if you recall, in the previous episode of this two-part mini-series, I read chapters 1 and 2 along with the preface to the Communist Manifesto, and then I said that chapter 3 is a bunch of basically kind of annoying junk where Karl Marx complains about other kinds of communism. But then there's this other document that's in my copy of the Communist Manifesto called The Principles of Communism. That's like a 25-point FAQ, frequently asked questions kind of document, except that's not actually what it is. What it actually is where Friedrich Engels was writing his program for the Communist League before the Communist Manifesto came out, which was actually originally written as a kind of confession of faith, so to speak. In fact, the Communist Confession of Faith. And he and Marx discussed that was inappropriate in late 1847, the Communist Manifesto coming out in 1848, and that delivering it as a kind of catechism, as it were, would not be the right way to go. And instead they published it as a manifesto. And then in this copy of the manifesto, this actual original Principles of Communism document is included. Turns out there's also a fourth chapter to the actual body of the Communist Manifesto as well. That's 2 pages. It's very short. And so I'm going to go through that fourth chapter of the manifesto now, and then the Principles of Communism as promised. So, Chapter 4 of the Communist Manifesto, Position of the Communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. And what you're going to hear is that this isn't that far off from the end of the Principles of Communism when we get there. He says Section 2 has made clear the relations of the communists to the existing working class parties, such as the Chartists in England and the agrarian reformers in America. The communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class. But in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement. In France, the communists ally with the social democrats against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, reserving, however, the right to take up a critical position in regard to phases and illusions traditionally handed down from the Great Revolution. So this is the nature of this short chapter, is actually to talk about these relationships to other parties and other countries, the parties in other countries. And I just want to bring this up. The first thing he says here, the first one they mention is France. And it starts off with this idea, well, the communists take the side of the working class everywhere, so we're going to ally with the social democrats against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie. But they reserve the right to be critical if they're not doing what the communists want. And so I just kind of want to throw in a piece. I don't want to make this a big piece of what we're doing here, but the communists have operated under what later got called by Carl Schmitt the friend-enemy distinction. You'll recognize that if you're listening to the podcast regularly as part of my Nazi experiment podcast series where I've talked about Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was, in fact, a Nazi. And he believed that the essence of politics itself is the distinction between friend and enemy. So here you have that expressed. He got that idea possibly from other places, but certainly he was studying the counter-revolutionaries such as de Maistre, who he was a big fan of. It's Joseph de Maistre, who was a counter-revolutionary against the French Revolution, which is the Great Revolution that's mentioned here in the Communist Manifesto. And here you have it. The communists ally, that's what's meant by friend in friend-enemy distinction, ally with the Social Democrats against, there's your enemies, the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, but they also reserve the right, because that friendship is not real friendship. Political friendship is not real friendship. It is allyship. It is contingent. And if you aren't doing what the party wants, you're no longer a friend. You're an enemy. The friend in the friend-enemy distinction is the same as the ally in trans-ally. And if you aren't doing everything they want, you're now a transphobic bigot, which is the enemy in the friend-enemy distinction. Carl Schmitt and much of what we're calling the woke right or new right or dissident right or whatever now are saying, yeah, what the communists understood first was that this is the essence of politics, and because they understood politics better than everybody else, they got all this power. But actually, this is wrong. What happened was the communists adopted this stance, as did the Jacobins before them in the French Revolution, and they caused a death spiral in their countries. What they did was actually, the friend-enemy distinction is not the criterion of politics, it is the criterion of war. So they turned politics into war. Everything else in the whole picture falls out. So to think that, the communists were ahead of the game and they understood politics better than their rivals, therefore we also need to do this, is to adopt a stance that we all need to take sides in some grand war and forget everything about civilization because now we're just in a fight. And you see this kind of painted here. He goes on, Marx and Engels go on, I should say. In Switzerland, the communists support the radicals without losing sight of the fact that this party consists of antagonistic elements, partly of democratic socialists in the French sense, partly of radical bourgeois. Same exact pattern. We ally with you, but there are parts of you that we're going to turn on later. In Poland, they support the party that insists on an agrarian revolution as the prime condition for national emancipation, that party which fomented the insurrection of Krakow in 1846. In Germany, they fight with the bourgeoisie wherever it acts in a revolutionary way against the absolute monarchy, the feudal squirearchy, and the petty bourgeoisie. Interesting, they'll even fight alongside the bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way. But they never cease for one single instant, it says, to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism, there's the enemy thing, between bourgeoisie and proletariat, and in order that the German workers may straightway use as so many weapons against the bourgeoisie the social and political conditions that the bourgeoisie must necessarily introduce along with its supremacy, and in order that after the fall of the reactionary classes in Germany, the fight against the bourgeoisie itself may immediately begin. So here we hear that essence of the friend-enemy distinction and why it's so awful. In fact, it's the politics of a rat bastard. What do I mean by it being the politics of the rat bastard? They're saying that they will ally with these different parties, including the revolutionary bourgeoisie of Germany, which is their mortal enemy in their theory, so long as it advances the revolution. But the second that they win against the monarchists, now they turn on the bourgeoisie. So the friend in friend-enemy distinction doesn't last very long. As a matter of fact, it's just an allyship of convenience. You can see this same kind of friendship in the so-called red-green axis, the communist and Islamic combination. It seems not to make any sense. What it is it's a union against a common enemy. So they are contingently allies or friends, but they will turn on one another once their common enemy is dispatched, and they'll move on to new enemies. This is not a good and healthy way to build a civilization. Marx and Engels continue. We're almost through this chapter, the last chapter of the Communist Manifesto, and I just want to point out that this is the part, we're getting close to the part where it gets really interesting and important. I think there's a very important point here for our present day, and I want to make it, and then we'll get on to the principles of communism. It says the communists turn their attention chiefly to Germany because that country is on the eve of a bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th and France in the 18th century. And because the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediate following proletarian revolution. So here we get to the business end. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. So there's your red-green axis explained. Here's why you have Queers for Palestine. Here's why you have all these strange alliances in the intersectional coalition, including, again, Queers for Palestine. because communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. That's it. The communists will, as they've just explained, opportunistically work with anyone trying to tear down the existing system and fully intend to betray them later. That's communism. That's communism. In all these movements, they say, they bring to the front as the leading question in each the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. So not just do they ally themselves with every movement trying to tear down the, quote, existing social and political order of things, they also drag their crap communist ideology in. They're going to try to turn whatever movement they colonize into a communist movement, and to the degree that they fail, they will turn on it. They are the enemies of everything, everywhere. But they're also opportunistic, deceitful bastards, rat bastards, as I said, who will use other groups only to turn on them later. Finally, we're told they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. So now we hear the reason why they're willing to ally with anybody, even people they dislike or hate, against the existing order. Let the ruling classes tremble, they say, at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. That's the famous last line. You've all heard it. You've probably heard it as workers of the world unite. The more accurate translation of the German is working men of all countries unite. It's carved on Karl Marx's headstone, as I've seen myself in Highgate Cemetery in London. Many of you have seen the picture of when I visited that I put out on social media. It went pretty viral a few times. So that's the declaration in the Communist Manifesto. They're against everything except themselves, and they're no longer going to hide it. And let the ruling classes all tremble, because their socio-Gnosticism is going to burst forth. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. That's the socio-Gnostic construction. They have a world to win. So there we end the Communist Manifesto, and we can turn our attention now to the principles of communism that preceded it. So now we've moved on from the manifesto to actually, as it's listed here in this document, to the genesis of the manifesto. The Principles of Communism, which is published it wasn't published until much later, in fact, into the 1960s here in English or something like that. The Principles of Communism, October 1847, so the year before the Communist Manifesto was written and published. And there's this little preamble. In 1847, Engels wrote 2 draft programs for the Communist League. So this wasn't just 2 guys doing something. Okay, it wasn't just Marx and Engels out floating in the ether deciding they're going to start some new political party. Remember, at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, they say it's a specter that's already haunting all of Europe. Okay, well, they were part of an organization called the Communist League. So in 1847, Engels wrote 2 draft programs for the Communist League in the form of a catechism, lest you doubt that it's a religion, by the way. One in June and the other in October. The latter, which is known as Principles of Communism, was first published in 1914. The earlier document, Draft of the Communist Confession of Faith, was only found in 1968. It was first published in 1969 in Hamburg, together with 4 other documents pertaining to the First Congress of the Communist League, in a booklet entitled Founding Documents of the Communist League. At the June 1847 Congress of the League of the Just, pause, record scratch, what's going on here? The League of the Just is a preceding organization that led to the Communist League, that led to the Communist Manifesto, that led eventually, after Lenin made it work, to the Communist Party and the fate of the 20th and 21st century. But there was this preceding thing called the League of the Just. And the League of the Just, which is sometimes called the League of Just Men, was actually a remnant organization of radicals in France that was composed of various revolutionary elements and the survivors of the purge of the Bavarian Illuminati. So this was like creepy secret society, revolutionary secret society stuff, all steeped to the very top of their assholes in esoteric nonsense. So we continue. At the June 1847 Congress of the League of the Just, which was also the founding conference of the Communist League, it was decided to issue a draft confession of faith to be submitted for discussion to the sections of the League. The document which has now come to light is almost certainly this draft. Comparison of the two documents shows that Principles of Communism is a revised edition of this earlier draft. In Principles of Communism, Engels left 3 questions unanswered and 2 cases with the notation, quote, unchanged. This clearly refers to the answers provided in the earlier draft. The new draft for the program was worked out by Engels on the instructions of the leading body of the Paris Circle of the Communist League. The instructions were decided on after Engels' sharp criticism at the committee meeting on October 22, 1847, of the draft program drawn up by the true socialist Moses Hess, which was then rejected. Still considering Principles of Communism as a preliminary draft, Engels expressed the view in a letter to Marx dated November 23-24 of 1847 that it would be best to drop the old catechistic form and draw up a program in the form of a manifesto. So here we have a theme that I just want to put some highlighting on. I want a phrase to enter your mind. You need to beware when you have either of the following 2 things: a theological movement posing as a political movement, which is what you have with the communists, or with the fascists. You also need to beware exactly the opposite, which is when you have a political movement disguising itself as a theological movement, which is what you have with the Christian nationalists and the jihadis of Islam. Think about those things. If it's theological, let it be theological. If it's political, let it be political. But when you have a political movement hiding as a theological movement, it's disguising itself for a reason. When you have a theological movement disguising itself as a political movement, it is also disguising itself for a reason. Those reasons are disingenuous. Those reasons are hiding their true intent. The intent of a theological movement hiding itself as a political movement, as you see with the communists here, is to give themselves cover so that people don't realize they're introducing a fanatical religion into the world. Again, this applies to the communists and to their reactionary element, the fascists. At the same time, when you have a theological movement hiding itself, that's what I just did. I got myself twisted up. When you have a political movement hiding itself as a theological movement, what you have is the attempt to subvert the faith to politics. Within communism, you actually have that operating in the case of liberation theology, but there's an extra step. You have a theological movement, communism, hiding itself as a political movement, as the Communist Party, then hiding itself again as a theological movement in liberation theology, 2 steps of disingenuous behavior. And what you get, you don't get the regular theology back. You get something corrupted. You don't get the faith. Well, the same thing, if you have a political movement like Christian nationalism or Islam hiding itself as a theological movement, you have something that is politically totalitarian hiding behind the Word of God in order to give itself credence and the ability to insinuate itself into society under false pretenses. You have what the Bible refers to as a wolf in sheep's clothing. So you have to be very aware of both of these things. Continuing with this short interlude. As the Second Congress of the Communist League, November 29 through December 8, 1847, Marx and Engels defended the fundamental scientific principles of communism and were trusted with drafting a program in the form of a manifesto of the Communist Party. In writing the manifesto, the founders of Marxism made use of the propositions enunciated in the Principles of Communism. So this thing that was originally a confession of faith that became a statement of principles through the League of the Just, spinning off into the Communist League for this express purpose. This is why the Communist League spun off from this secret society League of the Just, which again was made up of French radicals combined with basically Bavarian Illuminati secret society lunatics in exile, all revolutionaries. They created this League of the Just. It spun off the Communist League. And in the meeting where this happened, this is what the outcome was, the manifesto of the Communist Party. But its base document, its original idea, its two original drafts, Confession of Faith and then Statement of Principles, are, as a matter of fact, the product of their original thinking. This is where the genesis of, that's what I was wanting to get to say, this is the genesis of the Communist Manifesto, thus the Communist Party, thus the nightmare that we've all been dealing with since 1917 or earlier, depending on when we count the problem as really beginning. Engels uses the term manufacture and its derivatives, which have been translated as manufacture, manufacturing, etc. Engels uses this word literally to indicate production by hand, not factory production, for which Engels uses big industry. Manufacture, that's in German, you can tell because I said it wrong, I'm sure, differs from handicraft, which is guild production in medieval towns, in that the latter was carried out by independent artisans. Manufacture is carried out by home workers working for merchant capitalists, or by groups of craftspeople working together in large workshops owned by capitalists. It is therefore a transitional mode of production between guild handicraft and modern capitalist forms of production. So that's a disclaimer about the language. And now we turn to the Principles of Communism, which is the second draft of the Communist Confession of Faith, which is the genesis point of the Communist Manifesto, thus the Communist Party, thus the Communist nightmare that we're still having to fight today. And like I said, it reads like a long kind of FAQ. He asks or states, I think they're all questions. I'll have to see if there's any deviations. I don't remember off the top of my head, but he asks and answers 25 questions about communism. Some of the answers are extremely short. Some of the answers are a couple of pages long. So let's dive in and get through them. The Principles of Communism by Friedrich Engels, before Karl Marx turned it into the Communist Manifesto with him. 1. What is communism? His answer: communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. That's it. That's all he says. That alone we could probably talk about for an hour because it is a very loaded single sentence. The doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. So we have to understand that the proletariat is a oppressed class in a systemic oppressed way. That is a socio-gnostic oppressed class, and that it is seeking liberation, and communism will be the doctrine of the conditions of their liberation, which is to end in a stateless, classless society and all of this utopian garbage. 2, carrying on from the previous point, what is the proletariat? Okay, so we get the idea, although liberation actually is a Gnostic concept, and he doesn't fess up to that here. This is a confession of faith, after all. The doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. The second question is, well, what is the proletariat? So Engels explains. The proletariat is that class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor and does not draw profit from any kind of capital, whose weal and woe, whose life and death, whose sole existence depends on the demand for labor, hence on the changing state of business, on the vagaries of unbridled competition. The proletariat or class of proletarians is, in a word, the working class of the 19th century. So that's actually a very specific definition, which is actually what allows it lots of room to open up through the 20th century and into the 21st century. But the key is that it is people who don't have any kind of capital from which they can profit. All they have is their labor, which they're able to sell, thus turning them into another kind of slave who gets paid for his efforts, which means he's not really a slave, rather than being able to produce for himself. 3. Proletarians, then, have not always existed? ? No, Engels says, there have always been poor and working classes, and the working class have mostly been poor. But there have not always been workers and poor people living under conditions as they are today. In other words, there have not always been proletarians any more than there has always been free, unbridled competitions. 4. How did the proletariat originate? And this is our first longer answer. The proletariat, he explains, originated in the Industrial Revolution, which took place in England in the last half of the last, meaning 18th century, and which has since then been repeated in all the civilized countries of the world. I want to actually focus on the fact that England is named specifically as a problem here, just to point that out. The origin point of the issue is in England. He says the Industrial Revolution was precipitated by the discovery of the steam engine, various spinning machines, the mechanical loom, and a whole series of other mechanical devices. That is, technological progress caused a complete change in the ways that people work, the relationships between them and their work, and how they relate to one another because of their work. And that created a proletarian class that's wholly dependent on selling its labor as a sort of new kind of slave. These machines, Engels complains, which were very expensive and hence could be bought only by big capitalists, altered the whole mode of production and displaced the former workers because the machines turned out cheaper and better commodities than the workers could produce with their inefficient spinning wheels and hand looms. So the thing he's complaining about is that technology came along and produced cheaper and better commodities, which therefore displaced workers in inefficient modes of production. He says the machines delivered industry wholly into the hands of the big capitalists. So there's the problem, though. These machines are really expensive. The everyday average person can't have one, so they have to go work for somebody who can afford to get them. And they afford to get them by basically robbing these workers of their labor, and when they take all the labor of the workers and they amass a fortune off of it so they can buy these machines so that the workers have nothing. They can't access the machines, they can't compete with the output of the machines, so the only option that they have is to be a wage laborer for the people who have the machines, who displace them from their previous inefficient and low quality production. So it says the machines delivered industry wholly into the hands of the big capitalists and rendered entirely worthless the meager property of the workers, tools, looms, etc. The result was that the capitalists soon had everything in their hands and nothing remained to the workers. This marked the introduction of the factory system into the textile industry. Now I want to make a point here. Whatever you think about is the nature of what's happening in our world. I don't want to do this whole fourth industrial revolution Klaus Schwab thing, but I want you to think about this. We have had, I don't think their analysis is wrong in looking at what happened. The Industrial Revolution with its machines caused this kind of disruption, which my point that I want to make is then it created this invitation into a kind of resentment-laden, awful religion called communism. Then you have the electrification that comes along in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And when did communism actually take off in the world? When were you able to mobilize peasants who had virtually nothing to go bananas? Well, at that point. So you have another revolution that's now rendering large swaths of people, technological revolutions, rendering large swaths of people in a bad economic situation where certain small numbers of people are able to amass high tech of the day and change the entire landscape of working conditions, which then eventually makes its way out, trickles out under often a lot of difficulty to everyone and changes the economic landscape. Then you have this third revolution that we've all gone through, which is the digital revolution. We've lived through this, but this has happened in our lifetimes. This has happened since the 1990s, actually, and now we're already entering the same story with AI. And if you want to tuck social media in between and say that social media changed our information landscape completely, that's fine. So we're kind of picking up these large-scale shifts in how all production is engaged in very quickly. It's very disorienting. The reason I'm bringing up this point is because these are the conditions that the Marxists working for the Communist League as an offshoot of the Revolutionary League for the Just, or of the Just, these were the conditions that were being fomented that made communism seem popular. And now we're going through these similar things again. So much like my Nazi experiment podcast series, where my framing is there was this huge thing. All these things were happening in Germany in the interwar period at the end of World War I, then through forward to the beginning of World War II. And the Nazis came along and said, we have a way we can solve it. So they performed a grand experiment that was an utter failure. Well, the same thing's happening here. Conditions and technological advancement caused a gigantic disruption in the working conditions. And along come communists and say, we have a way to solve this. And it's an utter catastrophe. So what I'm suggesting is we're in conditions again where something like the communist experiment is going to seem very appealing to a lot of people. As a result, we're in conditions where something like the Nazi experiment as a reaction to the communist experiment is going to seem very hopeful and interesting to a lot of other people. And what we now have is basically, a shit sandwich and a turd hot dog staring at each other, and lots of people falling into both of these traps because of the underlying conditions that we must find a way to navigate more profitably and successfully these massive large-scale changes in production modes that, as Engels himself indicates, caused turning out cheaper and better commodities than we could produce in the previous technological state. This is actually the background story to what's actually happening, and we've got to figure out a way to navigate that. These changes in technology, which include the digitification of our economy, the introduction of social media, and thus independent democratic or alt media as a broadcasting opportunity. Why do all the young people in America want to be influencers? Well, partly because it's easy, partly because it's glitzy, partly because this and that. And we're all dismayed by this instead of wanting to be engineers and doctors and astronauts and cool things and fighter pilots and all of that. Why do they want to be influencers? Because it is actually a cutting edge job in the new mode of production in the economy. And there's an appeal to that. It's also easy, and it's also what they spend their time glamorizing, but it's just by the way, we need engineers and doctors and stuff, so that's a big problem. I'm not saying it's not a big problem, but it's also this new mode of production that social media opened up. And now we have this AI revolution literally staring us in the face rather horrifyingly, and it's going to be as disruptive or many times more disruptive to the means and modes of production. So we can expect ideological nonsense to get even crazier unless we can start charting a course through these real technological changes and production changes that gives people hope and inspiration and hopefully grounds them in a desire for liberty rather than radical ideologies that try to control things in a particular way. But I digress. Let's go back to the principles of communism, whichever number we're on. Once the impulse to the introduction of machinery and the factory system had been given, the system spread quickly to all the other branches of industry, especially cloth and book printing, pottery, and the metal industries. So Engels is complaining that the proletarian came about because basically every industry took up the technological change of the Industrial Revolution. Labor, he explains, was more and more divided among the individual workers, so that the worker who previously had done a complete piece of work now did only a part of that piece. In other words, specialization was increasing efficiency is one way to look at it, but people became disconnected or alienated from the product they were producing and why they were producing it. The division of labor, he explains, made it possible to produce things faster and cheaper. By the way, that is good. It reduced the activity of the individual worker to simple, endlessly repeated mechanical motions, which could be performed not only as well, but much better by a machine. In this way, all these industries fell one after another under the dominance of steam, machinery, and the factory system, just as spinning and weaving had already done. So again, this is still him saying we're in a situation of massive technological disruption of what it means to do work, and it has created this new class of dispossessed people. Now, history has borne out 170 some odd years later that he was basically full of crap. Like, we figured it out. People were able to build lives. In fact, we were able to build a gigantic middle class out of this, where people had fairly comfortable, wealthy, stable lives that we've actually come to expect with a degree of almost shocking entitlement and unawareness of how much it took to build that and what it takes to keep it. But at the same time, Engels continues, they also fell into the hands of big capitalists, meaning the means of production. No longer could average everyday people do productive work that was they were making their own handicrafts and engaging in a free exchange. No, now the only people who can afford the machines that make the stuff well and make the stuff fast and make the stuff cheap falls into the hands of big capitalists, and their workers, he says, were deprived of whatever independence remained to them. Gradually, not only genuine manufacture, but also handicrafts came within the province of the factory system as big capitalists increasingly displaced the small master craftsmen by setting up huge workshops, which saved many expenses and permitted an elaborate division of labor. This is how it has come about that in civilized countries at the present time, nearly all kinds of labor are performed in factories. And in nearly all branches of work, handicrafts and manufacture have been superseded. This process has, to an ever greater degree, ruined the old middle class, especially the small handicraftsmen. It has entirely transformed the condition of the workers, and two new classes have been created, which are gradually swallowing up the others. These are, one, the class of big capitalists, who in all civilized countries are already in almost exclusive possession of all the means of subsistence and of the instruments, factories and machines, and materials necessary for the production of the means of subsistence. This is the bourgeois class or the bourgeoisie. Two, the class of the wholly propertyless, who are obliged to sell their labor to the bourgeoisie in order to get in exchange the means of subsistence for their support. This is called the class of proletarians or the proletariat. He doesn't explain where the communists are in this at all, does he? He doesn't explain that they actually are people of means, usually people of inherited means, who are not subject to being propertyless, but have decided to take them up as a cause célèbre, which they actually use and abuse for their own attempt to grab power. But now you hear the logic behind communism in the 19th century, as articulated by Friedrich Engels in the document that led to the Communist Manifesto. That is what they were trying to say, is that, well, there's a middle class, people are able to make their own stuff and do their own thing, and these factories, the Industrial Revolution, this technological change, which, by the way, that genie's not going back in the bottle, this technological change is disrupting all of it. So you know what? It's time to throw off all of this crap society and try to do something radically impossible and be communists. 5. Under what conditions does this sale of the labor of the proletarians to the bourgeoisie take place. So they're going to elaborate that he's going to elaborate that these conditions are extremely unfair, alienating, exploitative, and so on. But this is the nature of setting up the socio-gnostic explanation for reality that's going to cause the people who become communists to become basically crazy, berserkers who are angry at the society that's oppressing them, rather than functional units within it who are trying to A, be productive within it, and B, find ways to make it better and more fair for people in reality, as opposed to through a radical socio-gnostic spasm. Labor, he explains, is a commodity like any other, and its price is therefore determined by exactly the same laws that apply to other commodities. In a regime of big industry or of free competition, as we shall see, the two come to the same thing. The price of a commodity is, on the average, always equal to its cost of production. Hence, the price of labor is also equal to the cost of production of labor. The price of a commodity is actually not equal to its cost of production. It's equal to its cost of production plus a profit, and that profit is justified by the risk and organizational skills and processes of the people who actually own everything, who have taken the risk to build a factory that costs them a lot of money, that might not work, that might not produce a saleable product. The risk of having to manage that thing and make it work with all these disparate people and interests, etc., etc. The risk of more technological change making what you're doing obsolete. You bet on a particular piece of machinery that gets eclipsed in 2 years by a new piece of machinery, and you made a bad bet. All that risk gets rewarded by a system that we call profit, because somebody took the risk to do it. And when it works, it brings something into the world faster, better, cheaper, as Engels said, that they wouldn't be able to get otherwise. But communism is based in the inability of these radicals to imagine a different mode of life, ironically enough, because what they actually want is an idealized form of the existing way of life, if we take them literally. I think, in fact, what they're doing is that they want their crazy idealism, and they're actually just appealing to this nostalgia for a dying world in order to motivate people. But I don't know Engels and his actual motivations. So we carry on. But the cost of the production of labor, Engels tells us, consists precisely of the quantity of means of subsistence necessary to enable the worker to continue working and to prevent the working class from dying out. The worker will therefore get no more for his labor than is necessary for this purpose. The price of labor, or the wage, will, in other words, be the lowest, the minimum required for the maintenance of life. Well, when is that actually possible, by the way? That's only possible when the people who own the capital, the capitalists, have so much of an advantage that they can actually get away with paying this unbearable minimum. As it turns out, the conditions are what you would see at the beginning of this kind of a revolution, when very, very few people have access to the technology, but not after it has come and settled through a little bit. And that transitionary period is uncomfortable and disruptive, but not nearly as much as these people try to predict. And again, I don't know if they're actually fearful or if they're actually just rabble-rousing. But think back, for example, think back to the invention of the personal computer, the PC, whether it's the Apple or whatever else, right? Even before Macintosh, believe it or not, there was a before Macintosh, Apple IIe. We all had them in schools at one point, if you're roughly 40-something right now. Okay, at the time, these computers, which can barely do, I mean, your cell phone is way beyond, way beyond what these computers, these things are like, they're pocket calculators. I don't mean like fancy ones. I mean pocket calculators that have vastly more sophisticated computing power and technology than these computers that you can pick up for tens of dollars, tops. But these things cost thousands of dollars in the 90s. And before that, tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars, and only a handful of institutions had them. Okay, a new computer when I was like a teenager was like a $2,000 to $3,000 purchase, and that was with 1990s bucks, right? It's insane how expensive it was to get a PC that could, I mean, I can, the numbers, we don't even talk about like meaningfully, unless you're like a gamer, we don't talk about how much RAM your computer has anymore. It just has enough. We just take it for granted that it has enough. But we're talking like, 2 megabytes of RAM. Like, I mean, crazy small numbers. And this thing was crazy expensive. And, they were changing very fast and people wanted new machines. And this was to do stuff like word processing and like the lamest graphics stuff you could possibly imagine. The point is, at the time, very few people could afford that stuff. And did they have some kind of an advantage? Well, if they had a PC and they had a printer, they could actually, produce documents in a way that the typewriter completely couldn't do. I remember actually when my family went from having a actual typewriter to this kind of digital typewriter where you could type out one line at a time and it would remember that much and then print the whole line. But if, you had to split a word or something, like you better factor that in and how you type. And this electronic typewriter. And then we skipped forward and bought an actual PC where you had a word processor and you could actually type your entire document and go back and edit it, and you didn't have to strike through anything, you didn't have to white out anything, you didn't have to feed the paper and try to get the line back up, you didn't have to do any of this crap anymore. You get the document the way you wanted it to and you could print it. And then you could have hundreds of documents that you wrote or downloaded, well, downloading was a little bit later, that you wrote or created or whatever, and you could print them whenever you needed. So months later, you need that document again, you can just go into your file folder and find it and print it again. And so this is a major upstep in how business could be conducted. But a lot of people couldn't afford these things. They were very expensive. And that's just one factor, by the way. That's not digital spreadsheets and everything else. That's just word processing, which is what I had access to experiencing, from my junior high to my early college years. And this is the kind of shift that he's talking about. And he's saying, but this is going to just dispossess everybody and they're going to pay everybody minimum. But that's not what actually happens. The technology gets better, it gets easier to make. It turns out the big factories that he hates are the reason. People figure out more efficient and better ways to make it. The technology improves, and before you know it, it becomes affordable for everybody, and it becomes a standard by which everybody can work, and everybody ends up being able to raise in their productivity for per unit time, their efficiency, their quality of output, etc., all go up. So he's describing the initial condition and a disruptive technological change as though it's indicative of the entire thing, and is going to, their prediction with the communists, which was dead wrong, was this condition is going to worsen and worsen and worsen until it becomes absolute and completely intolerable, which turns out to be the opposite of what happens when some new technology comes on the scene. The open question of our day is whether AI is going to create that problem or not, because of its intrinsically maybe different nature, or if it's going to be like the other pieces of technological advancement that we've had that have allowed us to completely enter into new higher modes of production by making use of the new technological tool. And AI, I admit, represents a kind of different scenario. But the communists were, to make the point, and still are, motivated by a completely incorrect understanding of how these issues work, especially today. They've had 150 plus years of seeing all of this turned on its face, and they're still whining and complaining about somebody else owning the means of production instead of actually just getting some of the surprisingly good stuff that they can get and start doing something productive with it. But productive is defined in terms of doing something useful for other people, which narcissists are bad at because they aren't good at imagining the needs of other people. Wonder what's really going on here. But I digress. However, Engels tells us, since business is sometimes better and sometimes worse, it follows that the worker sometimes gets more and sometimes gets less for his commodities. But again, just as the industrialist on average, of good times and bad, gets no more and no less for his commodities than what they cost, similarly on average the worker gets no more and no less than his minimum. Same thing, massive fluctuations due to demand and such in different conditions in the early part of the Industrial Revolution led to massive fluctuations in the demand for labor, which led to massive problems for the influx of people who are coming to be laborers in cities, coming in out of the countryside from the farms and so on. This economic law of wages, Engels explains, operates the more strictly the greater the degree to which big industry has taken possession of all branches of production. So as I said, he predicts that this is just going to get worse and worse. P.S. Did you notice that Engels is a much better writer than Karl Marx? Just going to throw that in here. 6. What working classes were there before the Industrial Revolution? The working classes, he says, have always, according to the different stages of development of society, lived in different circumstances and had different relations to the owning and ruling classes. In antiquity, the workers were the slaves of the owners, just as they still are in many backward countries and even in the southern part of the United States. In the Middle Ages, they were the serfs and land-owning nobility, as they still are in Hungary, Poland, and Russia. In the Middle Ages, and indeed right up to the Industrial Revolution, there were also journeymen in the cities who worked in the service of petty bourgeois masters. Gradually, as manufacture developed, these journeymen became manufacturing workers who were even then employed by larger capitalists. 7. In what ways do proletarians differ from slaves? Engels tells us the slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian must sell himself daily and hourly. So that's a neat spin on the idea of earning a wage. But the slave doesn't, in fact, sell himself at all. He does not sell himself. He is sold by others, right? So there's a fundamental lie happening here. The industrial slave, Engels says, property of one master, is assured in existence, however miserable it may be, because of the master's interest. The individual proletarian, property, as it were, of the entire bourgeois class, which buys his labor only when someone is in need of it, has no secure existence. This existence is assured only to the class as a whole. So here you have the communists, and we can characterize this a lot of ways, arguing kind of the same thing the woke right today argue, for example, which is that slaves had it better in some ways. You could also say that it's the same as the complaining class chronicled in the book of Numbers in the Bible, the Torah specifically, where after wandering the desert with Moses, they despair of finding the promised land and they complain, and one of the things they complain about is wishing to go back into bondage in Egypt from which they had been delivered. And God wasn't very happy with them. So the communists have this spirit of the complaining class who thinks that bondage might in fact be better than having to work in the conditions of the situation that you're in. And this, the Industrial Revolution, was that you have to go find you have nobody who has any interest in you, right? You hear this same from the woke right, who want this kind of nationalist project, or even a monarchy. The monarch has an interest in his subjects and in his kingdom, so he'll invest in them. Never mind the fact that you have literally no recourse, the feudal system being superior in many ways to the capitalist system. I have heard and seen this argument made explicitly by woke right people today. Even the slave, you'll hear them sometimes argue, had it better because the master had a vested interest in caring for him because it was his property he depended upon. And so that mutual or interdependence was a thing. Once you're liberated, as the Israelites who had escaped Egypt, once you're liberated and you're on your own, although they were being taken care of by God in that story directly with the manna from heaven and so on, once you're liberated and on your own, well, you've got to appeal to any number of people, places, or things in order to make your way. You actually have to figure out a way to be valuable, not under the command of somebody with whom you are interdependent, but for yourself. And isn't that intolerable? So he continues, the individual proletarian property, as it were, of the entire bourgeois class, which buys his labor only when someone has need of it, as if that's some kind of a sin, has no secure existence. This existence is assured only to the class as a whole. So this is a very important moment in this document. It is not the individual under a capitalist system that anybody cares about. In fact, there's nobody to care about you, to take care of you, to see you as an interdependent object. You are now an atomized individual, to use the language that the woke right is using exactly this condition. No. The existence is assured only to the class as a whole. You see, the bourgeoisie needs the proletariat class, but it doesn't need any given proletarian. That is one of these fundamental contradictions it's playing into. So the proletarian, the logic will be, must see itself not as an individual scrabbling for their existence or trying to provide value to others within this system of society, but as a member of a class, each individual being expendable while the class itself is the interdependent object. So Engels explains, the slave is outside competition, the proletarian is in it and experiences all its vagaries. Now again, we have 150 plus years to look at how that works out, and it turns out it works out great. It turns out that it works out really well. You're talking about a rising tide lifting all ships like nothing else in world history has ever seen, when you unleash the productive capacities of every individual for himself and his family. But the communists are negative about this, as we just explained. He says, the slave counts as a thing, not a member of society. Thus the slave can have a better existence than the proletarian, while the proletarian belongs to a higher stage of social development and himself stands on a higher social level than the slave. The slave frees himself when, of all the relations of private property, he abolishes only the relation of slavery and thereby becomes a proletarian. The proletarian can free himself only by abolishing private property in general. Why? Because private property is what allows the factory holders to own all the stuff, which creates them as a class. So only by overthrowing, as a class, the class that's expropriating them, can they possibly be liberated. So now we are shifting to this socio-gnostic framing. You're not an individual, you're a member of a class, and you have no opportunity except to work as a class, pursuing its class interests against an enemy class. In other words, by adopting what Carl Schmitt later called the friend-enemy distinction. So the proletariat class is a class formed in mutual enmity of the people who own things. And this is the destructive poison of communism. Rather than seeing themselves as people who can work and become people who own things, and that as more people work and become people who own things and establish this new middle class under these new conditions, that things are going to get better for everyone, that production of things will become more efficient, more dispersed, more competition between the big producers, forcing better wages, forcing better conditions, forcing everything. Rather than seeing it as that, it is class antagonism, class conflict, class warfare, and that's the only way. 8. In what way do proletarians differ from serfs? Engels explains, the serf possesses and uses an instrument of production, a piece of land in exchange for which he gives up a part of his product or a part of the services of his labor. The proletarian works with the instruments of production of another for the account of this offer in exchange for a part of the product. The serf gives up, the proletarian receives. The serf has an assured existence, the proletarian has not. The serf is outside competition, the proletarian is in it. Again, this idea of being inside of competition is the thing that they want to get away from, which basically means that they don't want anybody to have any private property, but that also means they don't want the proletarians to have private property. But what they're saying is, you don't have private property already, which is partially untrue, so nobody should have private property. Help us tear down private property. But private property is the foundation of wealth, prosperity, abundance, and in fact civilization. So they are motivating a class to become resentful rather than productive, Rather than pursuing the American dreams of picking yourself up and building something with your life so that everything gets better for everybody, actually, literally, including yourself first, and the others, whether you care about them or not, because you're being paid to help them solve problems that they have or didn't even know they have, and that's why they're giving you money in the first place. Rather than seeing it that way, it is completely different. The competition itself is the problem. We should just be magically cooperative, and therefore, because there's no interdependence happening, that is the problem. And again, the woke right makes literally the same complaint. They just locate the interdependence in the nation. We're all in this together as a nation, and that's the limit of sovereignty outside of the sovereignty of God. And so rather than seeing it in terms of class, they see it in terms of nation. But they still see the necessity of the same interdependence, which then has to be centrally planned, because obviously these people aren't capable of it. So Engels continues about the serf. He says, the serf liberates himself in one of three ways. Either he runs away to the city and there becomes a handicraftsman, or instead of products and services, he gives money to his lord and thereby becomes a free tenant, or he overthrows his feudal lord and himself becomes a property owner. By the way, this is their vision of the landlord and why they hate landlords so much. In short, by one route or another, he gets into the owning class and enters into competition. The proletarian liberates himself by abolishing competition, private property, and all class differences. In other words, everything I just said stands. 9. In what way do proletarians differ from handicraftsmen? Engels tells us. In contrast to the proletarian, the so-called handicraftsman, as he still existed almost everywhere in the past, meaning 18th century, and still exists here and there at present, is a proletarian at most temporarily. His goal is to acquire capital himself wherewith to exploit other workers. He can often achieve this goal where guilds still exist or where freedom from guild restriction has not yet led to the introduction of factory-style methods into the crafts, nor yet to fierce competition. But as soon as the factory system has been introduced into the crafts and competition flourishes fully, this perspective dwindles away and the handicraftsman becomes more and more a proletarian. The handicraftsman therefore frees himself by becoming either bourgeois, or entering the middle class in general, or becoming a proletarian because of competition, as is now more often the case, in which case he can free himself by joining the proletarian movement, that is, the more or less communist movement. Notice how he's setting up the communists as the only way to free themselves of the class identity, the exploited class identity of proletarianhood. This idea, again, which history has disproved, that there could be the building of a middle class and the dispersal of ownership by people making their way up, even though it didn't necessarily start that way, is just out of their vision. It's beyond their horizon, that a good life outside of basically the same exact model with them in control of it, that a good life can exist outside of their control. 10. In what way do proletarians differ from manufacturing workers? Notice how much time and effort he's spending defining what the proletariat is. Questions 2 through 10 have been only about defining who the proletariat actually is. Engels tells us, the manufacturing worker of the 16th to the 18th centuries still had, but with few exception, an instrument of production in his own possession. His loom, the family spinning wheel, a little plot of land which he cultivated in his spare time. The proletarian has none of these things. The manufacturing worker almost always lives in the countryside and in a more or less patriarchal relation to his landlord or employer. The proletarian lives for the most part in the city, and his relation to his employer is purely a cash relation. Again, the problem is the lack of interdependence between the different people and classes, so that the interdependence that he idolizes in the previous slave and feudal conditions no longer exists in the city, in the capitalist bourgeois to proletarian relation. The manufacturing worker, Engels says, is torn out of his patriarchal relation, which is, by the way, an interdependent relation, by big industry, loses whatever property he still has, and in this way becomes a proletarian. This is why they are referred to as the expropriated class as well. 11. What were the immediate consequences of the Industrial Revolution and of the division of society into bourgeoisie and proletariat? First, Engels says, the lower and lower prices of industrial products brought about by machine labor totally destroyed in all countries of the world the old system of manufacture or industry based upon hand labor. Notice he already said that it made things faster, better, and cheaper, but the way that we used to do it went away with technological advancement. In this way, he says, all semi-barbarian countries, which had hitherto been more or less strangers to historical development, and whose industry had been based on manufacture, were violently forced out of their isolation. They bought the cheaper commodities of the English and allowed their own manufacturing workers to be ruined. Countries which had known no progress for thousands of years, for example, India, were thoroughly revolutionized, and even China is now on the way to a revolution. We have come to the point where a new machine invented in England deprives millions of Chinese workers of their livelihood within a year's time. So again, there's this weird hearkening back to like subsistence labor, which is a very low quality and very hard work because a machine displaces them, not realizing that what that does is actually, to use their own word, liberates them to engage in higher forms of activity, though the disruption period is sometimes rocky. In this way, Engels explains, big industry has brought all of the people of the earth into contact with each other, has merged all local markets into one world market, has spread civilization and progress everywhere, and has thus ensured that whatever happens in civilized countries will have repercussions in all other countries. Sounds like woke right. Sounds like they don't like that at all. It follows that if the workers in England or France now liberate themselves, this must set off a revolution in all other countries. Revolutions which sooner or later must accomplish the liberation of their respective working classes. So if they have a socialist revolution in England or in France, just like how capitalism spread around the globe, socialism will spread around the globe. Second, Engels argues, wherever big industries displaced manufacture, the bourgeoisie developed in wealth and power to the utmost and made itself the first class of the country. The result was that wherever this happened, the bourgeoisie took political power into its own hands and displaced the hitherto ruling classes, the aristocracy, the guildmasters, and their representative, the absolute monarchy. So, along with this technological advancement of production, which is the liberal form of production, came liberal forms of politics that displaced outdated forms of politics that weren't compatible with it. The bourgeois, where are we at here? Sorry. The bourgeoisie annihilated the power of the aristocracy, the nobility, by abolishing the entailment of estates. In other words, by making landed property subject to purchase and sale, and by doing away with the special privileges of the nobility. It destroyed the power of the guildmasters by abolishing guilds and handicraft privileges. In their place, it put competition, that is, a state of society in which everyone has the right to enter into any branch of industry, the only obstacle being a lack of the necessary capital. He's describing this as though it's a bad thing. It's amazing that they look for liberation from what he's literally describing as liberation. The introduction of free competition is thus public declaration that from now on the members of society are unequal only to the extent that their capitals are unequal, that capital is the decisive power, and that therefore the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, have become the first class in society. So a few points. So here he is challenging this idea of all men being created equal because capital, having more, makes you unequal exactly like both woke left and woke right today say. Okay, so the other thing is how much he hates competition. It's not just interdependence. At this point, it's getting very obvious that competition itself, that somebody might use their private property, including their own self, body, brain, talents, and do better than somebody else, and therefore be able to climb the ladder higher and faster, seems to be part of the problem. He's said again and again and again that the problem itself is competition. They want cooperation instead, which they actually believe to be, if you remember the other things that we've read about the communists, especially economic philosophic manuscripts, to be the human true nature. So very against the idea of competition. But if you don't have competition, and yes, there is a positive form, and yes, there is a negative form. If you don't have competition, how in the world are you going to figure out what the right products are, the right prices, and so on? You're not. You're going to do it all by decree and so on. This is, again, an absolute misunderstanding of how things actually work. This is part of why Hitler was so successful in being able to put forth his insane racist ideology, his racial worldview, or racialist worldview that he promoted, because he kept saying again and again, as we've heard in the Nazi Experiment podcast, and we'll hear more as we do more of those, that it's the iron law of nature is the competition between things, and that the fittest should rise to the top. Now, he mischaracterizes it as well, but what he's responding to is, by that point, decades of communist garbage saying that competition is the problem. And he's like, no, competition is a solution. He just has a crackpot model of what the site of competition is. The site of competition should be in what terms of what value you can bring to a society that's willing to part with its hard-earned property to obtain what you're bringing, not in terms of some racial mode of production or whatever other nonsense. So Hitler had the specific wrong, but the generality right, and was therefore able to gain a lot of purchase against the communists, because the communists are over here spouting that competition is the problem when competition in the general is actually the solution. It's just not the competition that Hitler was pointing to. So these things are actually incredibly important for the development, and this is why you still see the same fights playing out between woke left and woke right. All of these things are understood in a very thin way, in a kind of deracinated way, but when we actually get underneath them and understand what's being said, you can understand the communists are against competition and want to abolish it. Other people recognize it as necessary, and then the reactionaries cook up a crackpot system in which competition matters in service to the collective. You must compete to be in better service to the collective. By the way, that's what happens in practice under communism too. People compete to be able to get access to the grift and the graft of the system, but the communists pretend that's not what's actually happening, whereas the fascists don't pretend that. So he carries on. The introduction of free competition is thus public declaration that from now on the members of society are unequal only to the extent that their capitals are unequal, that capital is the decisive power, and that therefore the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, have become the first class in society. And I apologize, I already read that little paragraph. Free competition, he says, is necessary for the establishment of big industry, because it is the only condition of society in which big industry can make its way. How about that? That's right. So big industry is going to be only possible, which means true advancement in the standards of living, abundance, and wealth, and so on, are only going to be possible through the thing that they hate. And that's why they hate it, because competition creates big industry. Big industry allows people to get better capital than the normal people can get, and they use the better capital to expropriate the normal people, and they can't see 2 miles down the road of how this shift might play out, and instead become reactionary loons against it. Engels continues, having destroyed the social power of the nobility and the guild masters, that would be the gatekeepers of old, the bourgeoisie also destroyed their political power. Having raised itself to the actual position of first class in society, it proclaims itself to also be the dominant political class. This it does through the introduction of the representative system, which rests on bourgeois equality before the law and the recognition of free competition, and in European countries takes the form of constitutional monarchy. Woke right, same complaint. This is why they say, this is Friedrich Engels, not Karl Marx, but this is why they say that Marxists have good critiques of capitalism and the liberal system. In these constitutional monarchies, Engels continues, only those who possess a certain capital are voters, that is to say, only members of the bourgeoisie, although we've achieved universal suffrage since, which they also couldn't anticipate. These bourgeois voters choose the deputies, and these bourgeois deputies, by using their right to refuse to vote taxes, choose a bourgeois government. In other words, they're saying that the bourgeoisie takes over and entrenches itself to the exploitation of the rest of society. Third, Engels explains, everywhere the proletariat develops in step with the bourgeoisie, that was a whole sentence, not a clause. Let me do that again. Everywhere the proletariat develops in step with the bourgeoisie. In proportion as the bourgeoisie grows in wealth, the proletariat grows in numbers. Why? Because as the bourgeois class gets richer, they have to have more proletarians working at poverty scale under them to support that wealth. That's basically the labor theory of value getting brought into the picture. 4, he says, since the proletarians can be employed only by capital, and since capital extends only through employing labor, it follows that the growth of the proletariat proceeds at precisely the same pace as the growth of capital. Imagine if you believed that that's actually how things work. What would you believe? Is that eventually the capital would get so big that everything is a very small number of capitalists and a very large number of proletarians who are being exploited by them, and you would believe that sooner or later people are going to rupture against that system, and the very small number of capitalists, proportionally speaking, will be destroyed by the very large number of people, and you can see how they would believe that the communist revolution is something that's going to happen. Simultaneously, Engels explains this process draws members of the bourgeoisie and proletarians together into the great cities where industry can be carried on most profitably, and by thus growing great masses in one spot, it gives to the proletarians a consciousness of their own strength. So it's by gathering these people together, a kind of proto-intersectionality, if you will, they realize how powerful they can be as a class. And this is what he's describing now, is that there are these intrinsic situations or circumstances within capitalism that give rise to this antagonism of classes, this intrinsic class conflict, friend versus enemies, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the proletariat are the dialectical antithesis of the bourgeoisie. So the proletariat is going to overthrow them to create this new thing, this new synthesis, this new synthetic or concrete structure. So here's the dialectical process. It's not that the proletariat's rising up of its own accord. It's that the bourgeoisie is actually producing its own negation that will destroy it through the intrinsic contradiction that he's trying to describe in terms of capitalism. That's why this is a confession of faith, by the way, a catechism. That's why that's what this was. This catechism is that there is a dialectical process to the movement of history that's playing out, and here's how it plays out between bourgeois and proletarians, and that's the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto. He carries on, moreover, the further this process advances, the more new labor-saving machines are invented, the greater is the pressure exercised by big industry on wages, which, as we have seen, sink to their minimum and therewith render the conditions of the proletariat increasingly unbearable. The growing dissatisfaction of the proletariat thus joins with its rising power to prepare a proletarian social revolution. So, as I was saying, 12. What were the further consequences of the Industrial Revolution? As though we haven't heard enough of this. Engels answers, big industry created the steam engine and other machines, the means of endlessly expanding industrial production, speeding it up, and cutting its costs. With production, we call that abundance, by the way. With production thus facilitated, the free competition, which is necessarily bound up with big industry, assumed the most extreme forms. A multitude of capitalists invaded industry, and in a short while more was produced than was needed. Oh, there's a sustainability argument here. How about that? As a consequence, finished commodities could not be sold, and a so-called commercial crisis broke out. Factories had to be closed, their owners went bankrupt, and the workers were without bread. Deepest misery reigned everywhere. Okay, so a bubble happened in the gold rush at the beginning. Think of the dot-com boom, so to speak, and this later revolution we lived through in the 90s. And bad things happened, and then guess what? People got along with it. But the communists find that intolerable. Things didn't work out perfectly. Oh, these guys come in and they're going to run it in this new system, and look, it didn't work. Terrible. They're awful. They're bad. Instead of people make mistakes and they correct them and build better systems that don't make the same mistakes again, hopefully. Except we keep making the communist mistake again and again and again, don't we? After a time, Engels explained, the superfluous products were sold, the factories began to operate again, wages rose, and gradually business got better than ever. Oh, how about that? But the boom and bust cycle is actually central here, and this is actually central to the sustainability nonsense we're seeing today. In fact, the purpose of the stakeholder economy, the completely managed economy they want to put us in, at its deepest levels includes, if you read Klaus Schwab and the Fourth Industrial Revolution and all of its stakeholder capitalism books, you will find out that one of the primary purposes of this managed stakeholder economy that they want to employ is to destroy the boom and bust cycle of the economy that they say is an intrinsic part of capitalism. Because if people have freedom, what happens is they all rush where there's a lot of money. Think in the 1848, almost the same year, when people discovered gold near San Francisco and they rushed there, or in the same in Alaska, and gold was discovered and people rushed there. Well, when there's a huge economic opportunity, or the dot-com boom, people rush in, and then it becomes unsustainable. The house flipping boom that we saw, a decade or so ago. People rush in, a lot of money is to be made, it becomes a bubble, the bubble pops, and then there's a collapse in the economy. And it turns out that there are ways to kind of predict these things and not let people just run wild, while still allowing people to have a very large amount of freedom in terms of how they negotiate these opportunities. But we also kind of want these things not to go off the rails, but we do want these kinds of booms to happen because they are massive breakthroughs. They happen because of massive breakthroughs in resource acquisition or production capacity. And we want people to take full advantage of them. And yes, some people will make bad bets. But how are you supposed to figure out which things are good bets if you don't allow this competition to take place? But that's the thing the communists are complaining about. But, gradually business got better than ever. Oh no. But it was not long before, he says, too many commodities were again produced and a new crisis broke out, only to follow the same course as its predecessor. Ever since the beginning of this 19th century, the condition of industry has constantly fluctuated between periods of prosperity and periods of crisis, nearly every 5 to 7 years. A fresh crisis has intervened, always with the greatest hardship for workers, always accompanied by the general revolutionary stirrings and the direct peril to the whole existing order of things. So that instability is something the communists have been trying to control ever since. And there are other ways that people have tried to manage it, because we don't actually want massive boom and bust cycles. We do want booms. We don't really want busts. And this will actually happen if people are free to go berserk in some new emerging market and all try to scrabble out their profit, as will always happen if there's freedom. So their answer has always been to try to introduce some kind of a controlled or planned economy. But what happens is that the people that end up controlling the economy are either complete technocrats and they're disconnected from what people actually need, and it's a disaster, or they play favorites to people that have ideological leanings like their own and end up destroying so many things. It turns out that there are ways to help control out of control bubble markets that are better than, say, communism or fascism. But you can understand the motivation as well. 13. What follows from these periodic commercial crises? First, Engels said that though big industry in its early stage created free competition, it has now outgrown free competition. That for big industry, competition and generally the individualistic organization of production have become a fetter which it must and will shatter. That so long as big industry remains on its present footing, it can be maintained only at the cost of general chaos every 7 years. Each time threatening the whole of civilization and not only plunging the proletarians into misery, but also ruining large sections of the bourgeoisie. Hence, either the big industry must itself be given up, which is an absolute impossibility, or that it makes unavoidably necessary an entirely new organization of society in which production is no longer directed by mutually competing individual industrialists, but rather by the whole society operating according to a definite plan and taking account of the needs of all. So notice a couple of things. One is the thing that we hear to this day, that anything that goes bad impacts marginalized and vulnerable communities most, which is just a fundamental law of reality. People who have more resources are better able to manage crises. That's why we actually want a free enterprise system, which creates massive abundance and prosperity, because we want even the poorest and most vulnerable among us to have enough resources to be able to survive calamities when they show up. We don't want people to be left in this scraping by at the barest minimum standard of living, where when a crisis shows up, they don't have excess resources. The reason this happens is because wealthy people have excess resources that they can spend on surviving the crisis, whereas the more vulnerable, poorer populations have fewer. So this is why the general raising of the wealth and abundance of an entire society, even its poorest members, is so important and has such dramatic effects at, say, preventing, say, deaths. So you say, oh, wow, we have this terrible hurricane and we have so many billions of dollars in damage, but we didn't have that many billions of dollars in damage when people lived in wood huts on the beach. And that's true, but a lot more people died. And it turns out that when you have more expensive things that people can afford to have because we have greater abundance, that they are better able to weather literal storms and also metaphorical storms. So that's one thing, but this is why what you always hear the communists whining and complaining about. Oh, there's more vulnerable people and they come out, proportionally even worse than wealthier people when something bad happens. So we should hate the wealthy instead of trying to make sure that there's enough resources for all. So relative and absolute privation get mixed and confused. That's a dialectical confusion, and I will say from the communists, it is intentional. But then what they say is, what Engels says is, look, there's only two possibilities here. Big industry is actually the problem. That's what he's saying. And there's only two possibilities. One is we get rid of big industry, and we can't go back. Remember, this is a progressive movement, but in regressive ways. And so we can't go back. So we can't go pre-capitalist, we have to go post-capitalist. We can't be pre-liberal, we have to become post-liberal. This is why communism is a post-liberal movement. So we can't go back. We can't have big factories go away. We have to go forward. We have to maintain the big factories, the wealth of all previous production stages of production, as Karl Marx put it 4 years earlier in the Economic Philosophic Manuscripts. We have to keep that, but we have to do it differently. There has to be an entirely new organization of society in which production is no longer directed by mutually competing individual industrialists. So we have to take them out of competition because competition is the problem, but rather by the whole society. And ever since, all we've dealt with is them trying to figure out how to make the whole society work. Communism's an experiment in that. Fascism and the folk and National Socialism is an experiment in that. And the stakeholder economy that they're fooling around with today is an experiment in how do we represent all of society in the decision-making of the economy according to a definite plan. So there's going to be central planning and taking account of the needs of all. So that's the stakeholder model, that's the folkish model, that's the communist model for the people, the people's economy, the folkish economy, or the stakeholder economy. They're all variations on the same program. And that program believes that if we allow people to have economic freedom, especially when you get up near the top, that they're not going to operate it correctly because they're in the mode of competition. He didn't even mention that competition becomes predatory and negative once you cross a certain scale, and they cannot envision that there are other possible solutions to these problems. I mean, I don't know if this is a good idea or a bad idea, but I stole this idea from the progressive tax structure concept. One possibility which people could play with is, when things get really big, when companies get really big, one of the games they play is called regulatory capture. So regulatory capture is where they start messing with the regulatory environment to make it very expensive for new startups with new and more flexible and adaptable technologies to be able to catch up. They make it very expensive through regulation, through government. They use the government. They lobby with huge corporate dollars, the government, to create a regulatory environment that, yes, it hampers them, but it also hampers their competition who can't afford it, to make sure that the competition can't grow. into a real competitor. So this is called regulatory capture. This is a problem. Well, you could create a regulatory system where the regulations that apply scale with your company. Smaller companies have fewer regulations put on them, and as they get bigger, there are more. The basics should always be covered, obviously, but as they get bigger they get more. It makes sense because small companies don't need to be regulated nearly as high. They don't have nearly as big of a footprint. They aren't likely to cause civilization scale disasters if something goes wrong, if they only have like 9 employees in a fairly local company. Therefore, it makes sense. We could do not a progressive tax where when you have more money you pay a higher proportion of taxes, but a progressive regulatory environment where the regulations don't apply when you're in a small startup company and apply increasingly as your company gets bigger. So if you want to continue to get bigger, you have to play by a stricter regulatory set, which actually makes sense. I don't know if that's a good idea or not. I don't know what the practical implementation of that looks like, and it might be total crap, because anywhere you create weird lines that you draw, like a company below this size has these policies and above this size has those policies, what you find is companies doing all kinds of crazy stuff to avoid crossing the line. Just in principle, though, it seems like an idea that could help deal with some of these problems, and they could introduce greater competition. As a matter of fact, it's kind of funny. I'm not a huge fan of distributism as a post-liberal applied philosophy here, but in terms of an actual policy, this is sort of distributist because it pushes out the means of production toward its ends rather than toward centralization. Distributism being another answer to the same problems. It's kind of the right-wing post-liberal answer to the same problems, but it comes from Catholic thinking specifically. But it's like the right-wing answer to the same problems of concentration of wealth that the communists were exploiting to make communism. I digress. Second, Engels tells us that big industry and the limitless expansion of production, remember these are continued problems of the Industrial Revolution, and the limitless expansion of production, which it makes possible, big industry does, bring within the range of feasibility a social order in which so much is produced that every member of society will be in a position to exercise and develop all his powers and faculties in complete freedom. It thus appears that the very qualities of big industry which in our present-day society produce misery and crises are those which in a different form of society will abolish this misery and these catastrophic depressions. So as it turns out, what was needed was time and some sensible regulation. What the communists wanted to do was to completely socialize the means of production. If you don't know what their solution to this was, laid out in detail in Capital by Karl Marx, their solution to this was that you already have socialized production in the big factories, so get rid of the factory owners as capitalists and replace them by committees, which the Russians called Soviets, that are going to run it in the name of the people. Basically turn every giant company into a giant cooperative, organized and run by a band of communist experts running communist theory called Soviets. It thus appears... Oh, sorry, I read that part. So he says, we see with the greatest clarity, one, that all these evils are from now on to be ascribed solely to a social order which no longer corresponds to the requirements of the real situation, and two, that it is possible through a new social order to do away with these evils altogether. So if you had any doubt that communism, as I've argued many times, is a left-wing, post-liberal movement, put those concerns away. Friedrich Engels, in the document that became the inspiration, the second draft of the Communist Manifesto, which was the third draft that got actually published, the second draft document explicitly says that what they're building is a post-liberal or post-capitalist situation that removes competition and replaces it by what we today call a stakeholder economy model. 14. What will this new social order have to be like? Above all, Engels says, it will have to take control of industry and of all branches of production, take it out of the hands of mutually competing individuals, and instead institute a system in which all these branches of production are operated by society as a whole. The stakeholders, we could say. He doesn't, but we could. That is, for the common account, according to a common plan, with the participation of all members of society. This is why, by the way, I, James Lindsay, am very skeptical of common good conservatism. I don't trust those central planners to decide what's in the common good any more than I trust these communists to decide what's in the common good, except that I do know that the communists are really, really bad at it because they have a very unrealistic picture for what it should look like. It will, Engels says, in other words, abolish competition and replace it with association. Cooperation. Whereas Klaus Schwab said it will no longer be an economy of production and consumption, but instead an economy of caring and sharing. Moreover, Engels says, since the management of industry by individuals necessarily implies private property, and since competition is in reality merely the manner and form in which the control of industry by private property owners expresses itself, it follows that private property cannot be separated from competition and the individual management of industry. Private property must therefore be abolished, and in its place must come the common utilization of all instruments of production and the distribution of all products according to common agreement. In a word, what is called the communal ownership of goods. So there you have it. Private property is the target because private property enables competition, and competition takes place between individuals. So individualism is the thing they're trying to destroy, and they want to replace it with communal ownership of goods. Now, that's a system that doesn't work because there are these things called free riders. There are people who don't produce anything of value or produce very little or would produce less if they didn't have to work for themselves to have a living or try to get ahead or try to make it better for their kids. And therefore, you enable those people by going into communal production. And then the people who are productive, the 20 or 30% who are going to work hard regardless, start getting very disgruntled that they're doing all this extra work for all these slackers, and the whole system comes down. So it turns out the woke right says that their critique is good, but their solutions are bad. Here are the bad solutions. But their critique is also not good. The woke right just happens to agree with it. They want a different common good model that's ordered and pushed through duty and other responsibilities that they cook up under their vision of the great myth of society. In fact, Engels continues, the abolition of private property is doubtless the shortest and most significant way to characterize the revolution in the whole social order, which has been made necessary by the development of industry and for this reason rightly advanced by communists as their main demand. So make no mistake, they want to abolish private property because that's the means of abolishing competition, and competition is the thing that takes place between competing individuals who are not operating according to their socialist true nature, which has been hidden from them. 15. Was not the abolition of private property possible at an earlier time? Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Remember, this is a catechism and a statement of faith, a confession, actually, of faith. And they're going to explain that no, you could not have abolished private property before this concentration into the pure dichotomous, conflict-oriented split into the bourgeoisie, which is a socio-gnostic demiurge, versus a proletarian, which is the dispossessed spiritual mass that must understand and crave and need and desire this change in ownership conditions. And in fact, that's what Engels said. Was not the abolition of private property possible at an earlier time? Engels says no. First sentence, no. Every change, he says, in the social order, every revolution in property relations is the necessary consequence of the creation of new forces of production which no longer fit into the old property relations. Private property has not always existed, he says. When toward the end of the Middle Ages there arose a new mode of production which could not be carried out under the then existing feudal and guild forms of property, this manufacture, which had outgrown the old property relations, created a new property form, private property. Again, it's the interdependence in all things that they want to get back to. And for manufacture in the earliest stage of development of big industry, private property was the only possible property form. The social order based on it was the only possible social order. Let me explain private property very briefly. Private property has in particular a property to it called the fundamental right to exclude. It's this radical, in fact, English idea that if you have stuff that you earned or made or bought and have a contract or a deed or a title or a claim upon, that you don't have to part with it under any conditions that you don't agree to. That's it. You have the fundamental right to exclude other people from property that is rightfully yours. That's what makes it private property. And he says that this didn't actually come into being at all, until the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the advent of the capitalists, who found it, because of the conditions, not a necessity, but an ability for them to say, all of this really expensive stuff I built to run my factories is mine, and you cannot have it. You can merely use it with my permission to do things I want you to do with it. Whereas in previous modes, whether it's the slave owner who owned his people as property, whether it's the feudal lord with his serfs who had made this arrangement to the landlord, there was an interconnectedness. That's what he's already made the case of. There's this interdependence, and we're going to get away from independence now and go back to interdependence. That's why I've said so many times that communism is a regressive movement posing as a progressive movement, or it's a regressive movement using progressive means. Fascism, on the other hand, I actually contend is the other way around. It is essentially a progressive movement that uses regressive means to establish a Reich or a hierarchical structure or a Leviathan that will enable the progress of man. But this, he says, private property, the fundamental right to exclude, didn't exist in the interdependent state of feudalism or slaveholding anytime before the situation of the bourgeois versus proletarian conflict in capitalism. So long, Engels says, as it is not possible to produce so much that there is enough for all, with more left over for expanding the social capital and extending the forces of production. So long as this is not possible, there must always be a ruling class directing the use of society's productive forces, and a poor, oppressed class. How these classes are constituted depends on the stage of development. The agrarian Middle Ages gave us the baron and the serf. The cities of the later Middle Ages show us the guildmaster and the journeyman and the day laborer. The 17th century has its manufacturing workers. The 19th has its big factory owners and proletarians. It is clear that up to now, the forces of production have never been developed to the point where enough could be developed for all, and that private property has become a fetter and a barrier in relation to the further development of the forces of production. So because everybody was interdependent before the ability to do mass production, thus produce more than enough for everybody, although not everybody has access to it because they can't always afford it. Before that, everybody was so interdependent, even for survival in this leaner, meaner situation of life, that you didn't have this kind of property relation. So property didn't become, as he says, a fetter and barrier in relation to the further development of the forces of production. See, when everybody faced privation, there was this coordinated effort to try to raise the means of production so that everything would get better. But now only the capitalists need to raise the means of production for themselves. And once they have as much as they can possibly get or want, or once they saturate the proletariat and can extract no more from them, then there's no reason to increase the means and modes of production. The forces of production can stop. But that's not what happened. They're just wrong. They're just absolutely wrong. Now, however, Engels says the development of big industry has ushered in a new period. Capital and the forces of production have been expanded to an unprecedented extent, and the means are at hand to multiply them without limit in the near future. Moreover, the forces of production have been concentrated in the hands of a few bourgeois, while the great mass of the people are more and more falling into the proletariat, their situation becoming more wretched and intolerable in proportion to the increase of wealth of the bourgeoisie. And finally, these mighty and easily extended forces of production have so far outgrown private property and the bourgeoisie that they threaten at any moment to unleash the most violent disturbances of the social order. Now, under these conditions, the abolition of private property has become not only possible, but absolutely necessary. All completely wrong. And it's very important to realize that the predictions of the communists were completely wrong. So here we have him talking about, right, as the forces of production have been concentrated in the hands of a few bourgeois, while the great mass of the people are more and more falling into the proletariat, their situation becoming more wretched and intolerable in proportion to the increase of wealth of the bourgeoisie, blah, blah, blah. You have Max Horkheimer, 1969, a Marxist, a neo-Marxist, technically the creator of the critical theory, explaining in an interview that Marx, this is Engels, but they shared this view, believed that the advancement of capitalism would immiserate the worker, but we have found that that is not so. I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember his exact wording. In fact, he says, Horkheimer explains, it does not immiserate capitalism. It does not immiserate the worker, but instead allows him to build a better life. So even somebody in the same vein of thought, 100 years later, is staring back at the last century of this prediction and saying, whoops, it was completely wrong. Completely wrong. 16. Will the peaceful abolition of private property be possible? Well, that's a very important question. So the idea here is, just to kind of frame it, is that, okay, so the means of production are socialized in the factory structure as it is, but you have these bosses who are profiting off of it, and they're not going to give it up. So they are expropriating everybody from their own properties for their own gain. And so the phrase that Marx uses is that you have to expropriate the expropriators. In other words, there's going to be the socialist revolution is going to come along, and it's going to basically say, look, we're already doing socialist production because of the structure of how a factory works, which is already all of us working together to create one set of products as under your direction. So how about it's under our direction instead of your direction, and we own everything here in common. Of course, what happens here, among other things, with the free rider issue I described earlier, which is called the tragedy of the commons, by the way, what happens here, in addition to that, is the fact that the risk is now distributed across the factory. The argument that the monarchists make, that the monarch cares about his kingdom and will therefore invest in even the least of it, which isn't quite true, does apply actually to the private property owner. His factory is his factory. His business is his business. And he will actually have to look after it, because anything that falls into disrepair not only hurts him, but costs him. And so he actually has this intrinsic motivation to make sure that that doesn't happen. Well, when you distribute the risk among the entire people, all of the people who work there, there's not enough pressure on any given individual to make sure things are going right. It just becomes easier and easier to let things slide, because what you have now is distributed risk rather than concentrated risk. And the reason that the capitalist gets to make the money, the guy at the top gets to make so much money, is because he shoulders the concentrated risk. But the concentrated risk means that he has to do extra effort and employ and mobilize resources so that that risk doesn't take him down. When you distribute the risk, you don't have the individuals necessary to be able to deal with the problem. Now this, of course, if we turn to our attention to Carl Schmitt, just as a sidebar, is what he's saying is the whole political situation. It's not just a matter of production and economy. The whole political situation needs this decision maker, or else it's all going to eventually fall apart. If we distribute decision making to everybody, then it's all going to fail. But this is exactly wrong. What we have in a system like the United States is that the actual individual is sovereign. So under Carl Schmitt's definition of sovereignty, he has the ability to decide the exception. So he has the ability to decide when he's going to, effectively follow the laws and policies and when he's not. And the way that we actually deal with that is with courts. If you decide that you're in an exception, so you have to take exceptional action and nothing bad happens, and it's fine. Only when you start violating somebody else's rights, who then has standing to bring a suit, is there a situation where we have your decision power getting limited in a free country. Thus, you distribute decision power. Thus, you distribute the capacity to solve problems to the places where those problems are at their roots. And you free up people to find solutions, to innovate, to be efficient and economical in how they solve them, to be productive, to be responsible. Actually, everything works better when you do this. Now, the thing is that sometimes you do actually violate other people's rights. People do mess up, or people make mistakes, or people are selfish, or people are bad, or whatever else, at which point somebody has standing and a suit comes. And we also have this thing called the law, which the law is a bunch of codes, effectively. Also regulations are a bunch of codes that help us understand where those violations have occurred in the past and prevent them from happening in the future proactively, because we actually also understand that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's actually a system that works. But anyway, this is just a related circumstance. Carl Schmitt saying that society should be run like a giant corporation is not correct. Society is a very different kind of thing than a giant corporation. However, a corporation, or at least departments or subsidiaries within a corporation, should probably run where there is concentration of risk in the owners, because if you distribute the risk too far, nobody has enough skin in the game to be concerned with what's going wrong to take action to do it. So his model, Engels' model for how businesses should be run, which is the opposite of free enterprise, this communal ownership model, distributes risk and distributes responsibility so far that there is no responsibility and everything starts falling apart. So anyway, I digressed a lot there. The story of communism is they already have socialized production and they have this new model, so why don't we just switch to it? Well, aside from what I just explained, that it's not realistic and isn't going to work, in fact, it was fail catastrophically, there's also the fact that the people who actually own the stuff, who they say are entrenched in the government and have the force of the state on their side and every other thing because of they think it's corruption, but it's not. It's the literal maintenance of a society. When they have large reservoirs of resources available to them, there are going to be vultures and all kinds of things that come and try to steal those resources or make use of them in illegal ways, and they do need protection of securing their property rights through the state is actually very difficult and requires it to be done. So the point is, these guys aren't going to willingly give up their factories to these communal modes of ownership, which they also probably are savvy enough to know aren't going to work. But even if they thought it could work, they're not likely to distribute it. Now, here's again a big disconnect, right? A lot of times these so-called capitalists understand that the communist system's not going to work, so they have many reasons to hold on to their stuff. The communists, on the other hand, do not understand this. They think their stupid system is going to work, and in fact is going to work better, and as you keep hearing from Engels, is in fact necessary. So believing that their system is necessary and actually going to work, they think the only reason, and this is where they get twisted and their brains go evil, the only reason that the factory holders aren't willing to switch roles is because they're selfish. They don't understand that there's also, besides the this is mine and I worked hard for it and therefore I'm keeping it motivation that they hate, there's also the fact that many of these people are savvy business owners that have done things in the world and produced a lot and understand the risks involved and the costs and expenditure and every other thing that they've had to do, and they're therefore fully aware that a commune isn't going to work, right? But the communists cannot understand this, and that disconnect is very fundamental to why this conflict keeps happening, because young and naive and dispossessed and angry and frustrated and whatever people tend not to understand what it means to have built something complicated and expensive and risky, and therefore don't understand all of the forces that actually make a thing work. So they think only in terms of very base motivations like selfishness, which the communists, of course, encourage. So anyway, the point is, how are you going to switch modes from a private property model to a communist model, communal ownership, when the property owners don't want it? So you have to ask this question: will the peaceful abolition of private property be possible? And Engels says, well, it would be desirable if this could happen, and the communists would certainly be the last to oppose it. Communists know only too well that all conspiracies are not only useless, but even harmful. So that, by the way, he's calling himself a conspiracy. Communism's a conspiracy, by the way. They know all too well that revolutions are not made intentionally and arbitrarily, but that everywhere and always they have been the necessary consequence of conditions which were wholly independent of the will and direction of individual parties and entire classes. But they also see that the development of the proletariat in nearly all civilized countries has been violently suppressed, and that in this way, the opponents of communism have been working toward a revolution with all their strength. If the oppressed proletariat is finally driven to the revolution, then we communists will defend its interests of the proletarians with deeds as we now defend them with words. So what that was is standard communist word salad to avoid admitting that this is going to be violent. That it's going to be violent. There's no way around it. Lots of word salad. 17. Will it be possible for private property to be abolished at one stroke? Engels. No. No more than the existing forces of production can at one stroke be multiplied to the extent necessary for the creation of a communal society. In all probability, the proletarian revolution will transform existing society gradually and will be able to abolish private property only when the means of production are available in sufficient quantity. That actually is partly a nod to the dialectic, that one of the dialectics at the heart of communism, which is the dialectic of quantity changing into quality, and meaning having enough stuff under capitalism is going to transform into, that's quantity is going to transform into quality, which is going to be a socialist mode of production, which they then say will transform back into quantity in the abundance of communism when they can finally figure out how to make communal production work, which they can't and never will. 18. What will be the course of this revolution? Engels says, above all, it will establish a democratic constitution, and through this, the direct or indirect dominance of the proletariat. So this is where you get all the stuff in Lenin that we covered before, that there's going to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, and that's going to be true democracy because it stops all the rich people from having too much of a voice. Direct in England, he says, where the proletarians are already a majority of the people. Indirect in France and Germany, where the majority of people consist not only of proletarians, but also of small peasants and petty bourgeois who are in the process of falling into the proletariat, who are more and more dependent in all their political interests on the proletariat, and who must therefore soon adapt to the demands of the proletariat. Perhaps this will cost a second struggle, but the outcome can only be victory of the proletariat. Democracy, he says, would be wholly valueless to the proletariat if it were not immediately used as a means for putting through measures directed against private property and ensuring the livelihood of the proletariat. The main measures. So what's the point of having a democracy, which is defined as only the people who are considered people, which is defined as only the proletariat, because otherwise you would allow the property interest people to vote for themselves, and they have too many resources, so that's not fair. Well, it would be worthless to them, Engels says, except that it can be used to destroy the private property. The main measures, he says, emerging as the necessary result of existing relations are the following. 1. Limitation of private property through progressive taxation, heavy inheritance taxes, abolition of inheritance through collateral lines, brothers, nephews, etc., forced loans, etc. 2. Gradual expropriation of the landowners, industrialists, railroad magnates, and ship owners, partly through competition by state industry, partly directly through competition in the form of bonds. 3. Confiscation of the possessions of all immigrants and rebels against the majority of the people. So this idea that they're going to rip everybody off who opposes them and treat them as non-people, non-citizens, total subjects, slave labor, whatever, right there. 4. Organization of labor or employment of proletarians on publicly owned land, in factories and workshops, with competition among the workers being abolished, and with the factory owners, insofar as they still exist, being obliged to pay the same high wages as those paid by the state. It's all the most artificial nonsense in the world. The state can't even produce value, so all it can do is redistribute value. So that's just going to be massive theft in order to try to create conditions. So the state becomes the most lucrative employer, so the labor will move to the state, and it will either the factory owners that can still work, like survive that situation with all their labor going to the state, which pays them more, artificially, by the way, through stolen taxpayer money. All of that, if they can survive it, or they're going to have to raise all their wages just to be competitive. So they're going to use a state-driven, artificial way to hijack and drive up wages, but because the state isn't producing anything meaningfully itself, it is not producing profit itself, is going to make a massive, this is a massive black hole. It's all just going to fall apart. 5. An equal obligation on all members of society to work until such time as private property has been completely abolished. Formation of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So industrial armies, it turns out, and agricultural armies were giant catastrophes. Treating the industrial process or treating the agricultural process the way that as a military operation turns out not to work. Turns out the fascists, and Hitler in particular, made a very similar very similar mistake, I should say. But notice this: an equal obligation on all members of society to work until such time as private property has been completely abolished. So everybody's going to have to do the labor that the state says they're going to have to do. And guess who's going to be exempted from it? The party members, because they're doing managerial organizational work. 6. Centralization of money and credit in the hands of the state through a national bank with state capital, and the suppression of all private banks and bankers. 7. Increase in the number of national factories, workshops, railroads, ships, bringing new lands into cultivation and improvement of land already under cultivation, all in proportion to the growth of the capital and labor force at the disposal of the nation. 8. Education of all children from the moment they can leave their mother's care in national establishments at national cost. Big public education. Education and production together. 9. Remember, this was written in 1847. There were no public education facilities anywhere in 1847, but that's what he's calling for. 9. Construction on public lands of great palaces as communal dwellings for associated groups of citizens engaged in both industry and agriculture, and combining in their way of life the advantages of urban and rural conditions while avoiding the one-sidedness and drawbacks of each. That just sounds perfectly magical. 10. Destruction of all unhealthy and jerry-built dwellings in urban districts. 11. Equal inheritance rights for children born in and out of wedlock. So already attacking the institution of marriage and family. 12. Concentration of all means of transportation in the hands of the nation. That sounds great. It is impossible, he says, of course, to carry out all of these measures at once, but one will always bring others in its wake. Once the first radical attack on private property has been launched, the proletariat will find itself forced to go even further, to concentrate increasingly in the hands of the state all capital, all agriculture, all transport, all trade. All the foregoing measures are directed to this end, and they will become practicable and feasible, capable of producing their centralizing effects to precisely the degree that the proletariat, through its labor, multiplies the country's productive forces. That, by the way, was tried. It was tried in Soviet Union. It was tried in the Eastern Bloc countries that were largely Soviet satellites. It was tried in North Korea after it was tried in China. It doesn't work. It is an absolute catastrophe. Finally, Engels explains, when all capital, all production, all exchange have been brought together in the hands of the nation, private property will disappear of its own accord. Money will become superfluous, and production will so expand, and man will so change, that society will be able to slough off whatever its old economic habits whatever of its old economic habits may remain. Again, this is a confession of faith. They believe that this change in man and society and production will occur if they adopt this model strongly enough so that then the evil that they want to abolish, private property, will disappear all by itself, because it just won't be necessary anymore, because there'll just be so much of everything, and man will be so different in how he interacts with the world and other things that it simply won't be necessary. That is a transformational faith. That is the idea that when everybody's fully transformed in their heart through the baptism of the communist spirit, that it'll finally work. And then they just kill millions of people trying to make that work out. 19. Will it be possible for this revolution to take place in one country alone? No, Engels said. By creating the world market, big industry has already brought all the peoples of the earth, and especially the civilized peoples, into such close relation with one another that none is independent of what happens to the others. Further, it has coordinated the social development of the civilized countries to such an extent that in all of them, bourgeoisie and proletariat have become the decisive classes, and the struggle between them, the great struggle of the day. Struggle being the same struggle that's in Mein Kampf for Hitler, by the way. It follows that the communist revolution will not merely be a national phenomenon, but must take place simultaneously in all civilized countries. That is to say, at least in England, America, France, and Germany. It will develop in each of these countries more or less rapidly according as one country or the other has a more developed industry, greater wealth, a more significant mass of productive forces. Hence, it will go slowest and meet the most obstacles in Germany, most rapidly and with fewest difficulties in England. And it will have a powerful impact on the other countries of the world, and it will radically alter the course of development which they have followed up to now, while greatly stepping up its pace. It is a universal revolution and will accordingly have a universal range. Probably the least accurate prediction of the entire document. It didn't happen in any of those places. It certainly didn't happen in that order. It certainly didn't happen faster the way that he said. And it happened first in peasant societies like Russia and then China. Just didn't work. It just didn't happen. It happened exactly the opposite of his predictions, which, by the way, the neo-Marxists like Max Horkheimer also recognized. In fact, the cultural Marxist or Western Marxist tradition arose specifically because of the catastrophe that you could say of 1917, where socialism took place in a peasant society but had failed in every industrial society. And they had a crisis. The Western Marxists, Antonio Gramsci, George Lukács, and so on, were at least, and eventually the Frankfurt School guys, were at least honest enough to recognize that Marx and Engels were fundamentally wrong. They were not honest enough to abandon the vision of a socialist society, but they at least recognized that this stuff was totally wrong. They were wrong in their day, they were wrong in their predictions, they were totally wrong. Surprising that anybody thinks it's going to work when so much of it's totally wrong. 20. What will be the consequence of the ultimate disappearance of private property? Engels tells us society will take all forces of production and means of commerce, as well as the exchange and distribution of products, out of the hands of private capitalists, and will manage them in accordance with a plan based on the availability of resources and the needs of the whole society. So central planning. We call it a stakeholder economy today. In this way, most important of all, the evil consequences which are now associated with the conduct of big industry will be abolished. There will be no more crises. That sounds great. The expanded production for which for the present order of society is overproduction, and hence a prevailing cause of misery, will then be insufficient and in need of being expanded much further. So we're not going to overproduce anymore. Abundance was actually going to go away. Instead of generating misery, overproduction will reach beyond the elementary requirements of society to assure the satisfaction of needs of all. It will create new needs and at the same time the means of satisfying them. It will become the condition of and the stimulus to new progress, which will no longer throw the whole social order into confusion as progress has always done in the past. Big industry, freed from the pressure of private property, will undergo such an expansion that what we now see will seem as petty in comparison as manufacture seems when put beside the big industry of our own day. This development of industry will make available to society a sufficient mass of products to satisfy the needs of everyone. Turns out that was 150% completely wrong. 10,000% fake. This is why this is a confession of faith. Now, the difference is that with like the capitalist mode of production, at least there's a clear vision of how it's going to work. There's no vision for how the state's going to make it work. That's their vision. We'll make it, or the communists have the vision, we're going to make it work. In the capitalist mode of production, there is a picture for how it works. It's a very simple one. Well, let's let people have stuff and let them solve their own problems. And when they solve a problem that helps other people, let them sell the solution they come up with. That sounds like it's going to work to solve problems. This, however, is exactly the opposite. Oh, we're going to plan everything. There'll be no excesses. There'll be no boom and bust. There'll be no crisis at all because we're going to plan it. How? Well, we're going to plan it. How? Well, you're going to plan it right. How? Communism doesn't know how. That's what I've been saying all along. We have shirts for that. Buy the shirts. The same will be true of agriculture. Yeah, right. That's why like 200 million people starved in communist countries. The same will be true of agriculture, Engels says, which also suffers from the pressure of private property and is held back by the division of privately owned land into small parcels. Now, socialist experiments in agrarian societies had already been attempted by this point and were already catastrophes. So this is amazing that he's saying this. I mean, stretching back into the early 1600s, people were experimenting with this and it was a complete failure. Here, Engels says, existing improvements in scientific procedures will be put into practice. There's your Lysenkoism, 30 million dead, with a resulting leap forward. Ooh, look at that language, which will assure to society all the products it needs. So there's Mao's Great Leap Forward, which surely he was aware of Engels writing this at the time. In this way, such an abundance of goods will be able to satisfy the needs of all its members. Didn't work. Doesn't work. The division of society into different mutually hostile classes will then become unnecessary. This is their conflict theory of society, that because there is privation or relative privation, classes form and they're antagonistic to one another, and that's the intrinsic state of society. That's the socio-gnostic framing, actually, once it gets entrenched. And so that's an incorrect model of society, and this is an incorrect prediction. Indeed, he says, it will be not only unnecessary, but intolerable in the new social order to have antagonism of classes. The existence of classes originated in the division of labor, and the division of labor as it has been known up to the present will completely disappear. That's probably not true, actually. Again, just completely wrong. The existence of classes did not originate in the division of labor. It originated in the division of talent and willingness to apply it. Some people work harder than other people, and they're better at certain things, and they're lucky enough to figure out what those things are, so they rise. It's not the division of labor. Some of them are better at managing other people and willing to take risks. We have very low risk taking. This is probably why when you give leftists testosterone, they become more conservative and thus more capitalist, because they're more willing to take risks with higher testosterone. This is a low T theory. Very, very clearly. For mechanical and chemical processes, he explains, are not enough to bring industrial and agricultural production up to the level we have described. The capacities of the men who make use of these processes must undergo a corresponding development. Yeah, give them better diets and let them have some testosterone, and they'll kick you useless commies out. Just as the peasants and manufacturing workers of the last century, Engels says, changed their whole way of life and became quite different people when they were drawn into big industry, in the same way communal control over production by society as a whole and the resulting new development will both require an entirely different kind of human material. People will no longer be as they are today, subordinated to a single branch of production, bound to it, exploited by it. They will no longer develop one of their faculties at the expense of all others. They will no longer know only one branch of a single branch of production as a whole. Even industry as it is today is finding such people less and less useful. So again, he undercuts himself, not understanding the things he's looking at in the least, but this idea that there's going to have to be a fundamentally new kind of person that is produced by the impositions of the society, that is what Marx called inversion of praxis, which we should call totalitarianism, is in fact here already. Industry, he says, controlled by society as a whole and operated according to a plan, presupposes well-rounded human beings, their faculties developed in balanced fashion, able to see the system of production in its entirety. As it turns out, that's actually not very efficient because people have different talents, different skills, and different aptitudes. The Chinese experimented with this. The Chinese communists tried to make sure that everybody was a farmer, a soldier, a businessman, a worker in the industries, etc. And it turns out that it was a complete disaster because different people are good at different things, interested in different things, and so on. When you give them freedom rather than a centrally planned nonsense where you have this theory of well-roundedness and total mastery of everything, turns out that they actually can become masters of a trade rather than a jack of a trade rather than masters of none. Engels continues, the form of the division of labor, which makes one a peasant, another a cobbler, a third a factory worker, a fourth a stock market operator, has already been undermined by machinery and will completely disappear. We hear exactly the same stuff about AI today, but notice what he said, the form of the division of labor that makes these people. It's not the form of the division of labor. It's that different people have different aptitudes, and the more freedom they have, the more they can gravitate toward the things that they have aptitude in, which raises productivity, raises abundance, raises satisfaction, raises happiness. What in the hell these communists don't understand? Education, he says, will enable young people quickly to familiarize themselves with the whole system of production and to pass from one branch of production to another in response to the needs of society or their own inclinations. So they want actually literally fungible, interchangeable parts as people. But the problem is in seeking to become a jack of all trades, they become a master of literally nothing. And in fact, in many cases, they become competent at basically nothing except obeying the party and ratting out their neighbors. It will, Engels tells us, therefore free them from the one-sided character with which the present-day division of labor impresses upon every individual. See, so there's ideas that there's this intrinsic division of labor that's imposed on everybody, so everybody has to do the thing that they happen to be doing, and they don't have any other options, and they could be freed up to do all the other things if we just educated them to be good at everything. Communist society, he says, will in this way make it possible for its members to put their comprehensively developed faculties to full use. But when this happens, classes will necessarily disappear. Again, a bad theory of why there's classes. It follows that society organized on a communist basis is incompatible with the existence of classes on the one hand, and that the very building of such a society provides the means of abolishing class differences on the other. Now, there's a dangerous statement if ever there was one, because what it is a statement of faith that by building the program they're going to abolish the classes and achieve this utopia, which is all based on bad theory of what's actually going on. A corollary of this, he says, is that the difference between city and country is destined to disappear. I'm not exactly sure how that's supposed to work. Countryside is dispersed and therefore necessarily has horizontally integrated communities, whereas cities are concentrated, much more anonymity, much more dependency on services, and are therefore much more vertically integrated. They're fundamentally different environments, so it's not at all clear how that's supposed to work. But he says the management of agriculture and industry by the same people rather than by two different classes of people is, if for only purely material reasons, a necessary condition of the communist association. So he doesn't know how that works either. The dispersal of the agricultural population on the land alongside the crowding of the industrial population into the great cities is a condition which corresponds to an undeveloped state of both agriculture and industry and can already be felt as an obstacle to further development. How the hell does he think it's supposed to work? He apparently thinks that this stuff is arbitrary, that people that are in rural farming areas are dispersed for strange reasons that are inexplicable, other than the fact that farms take up a lot of freaking land, and then people that all work in the same factory, which they have to be able to get to, so they have to live near, cram themselves into densely populated cities. Like, this isn't like some imposition that the countryside is sparsely populated and the cities are densely populated. It's literally a condition of what makes them each what they are. But the communists don't understand anything. So that's shit that they think they're going to be able to pull into their central plan and reorganize and remanage. And it's simply not going to work. Where did I leave off? The dispersal, he says, of the agricultural population on the land. Oh, I just did that part. Okay. The general cooperation, he says, of all members of society for the purpose of planned exploitation of the forces of production. So now their goal is to cooperate with all members of society for the purpose of the planned exploitation of the forces of production, because that's what they think all production is exploitation of the forces of production. So they're telling you right here that they're going to abuse and exploit their workers. They don't actually know how things are run. It says the expansion of production to the point where it'll satisfy the needs of all, the abolition of a situation in which the needs of some are satisfied at the expense of the needs of others, the complete liquidation of classes and their conflicts. All this is like pie in the sky misunderstanding of what's really going on in the world. The rounded development of the capacities of all members of society through the elimination of the present division of labor, through industrial education, through engaging in various activities, through the participation by all in the enjoyments produced by all, through the combination of the city and country. These are the main consequences of the abolition of private property. And if you didn't think this is a faith, now you do. That's a statement of faith. 21, and this is a doozy. Actually, these next three are a doozy. What will be the influence of communist society on the family? Engels tells us, it will transform the relations between the sexes into a purely private matter which concerns only the persons involved and into which society has no occasion to intervene. It can do this since it does away with private property and educates children on a communal basis, and in this way removes the two bases of traditional marriage, the dependence rooted in private property of the woman upon the man and of the children on the parents. And here is the answer to the outcry of the highly moral Philistines against the community of women. That's in scare quotes, and I want you to just think about what the community of women means. Give you a second to ponder that. So they're already being accused of creating a community of women. It means all the women are shared in common, right? Here's the answer to the outcry of the highly moral Philistines against the so-called community of women. Community of women is a condition which belongs entirely to bourgeois society, and which today finds its complete expression in prostitution. But prostitution is based on private property and falls with it. Thus, communist society, instead of introducing a community of women, in fact, abolishes it. Just a straight inversion. So the literal plan is, and they were being called out for it, is that all the women will be shared in common. So somehow this is going to turn into this basically mass prostitution situation. He's like, nuh-uh, because there's not going to be any money involved. It's going to be exactly the same thing, actually, and it's going to actually be depending on their ability to survive in that situation, as we all know how it would really develop. But no, there's no money involved, so it's fine. But they're going to get rid of the family because the family's not necessary, because we're going to communally educate the children, so there's no dependence of children on their parents. And then women, there's no need for a traditional marriage anymore. You don't have to have one man married to one woman because she's not going to need to be dependent on him. So you can hear the whole feminist movement and the queer, like, weird children liberation thing that they're doing in all these so-called sanctuary, LGBTQ sanctuary states. All presaged here in the precursor to the Communist Manifesto. 22, what will be the attitude of communism to existing nationalities? Engels' answer, the nationalities of the peoples associating themselves in accordance with the principle of community will be compelled to mingle with each other as a result of this association, and thereby to dissolve themselves, just as the various estate and class distinctions must disappear through the abolition of their basis, which is private property. 23. What will be its attitude to existing religions. And I covered this in the Marxism is Not Atheist podcast. It was very controversial. All religions, Engels tells us, all religions so far have been the expression of historical stages of development of individual peoples or groups of peoples, but communism is the stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and brings about their disappearance. So religion is the thing that religion is a thing that will go away when it's replaced by the communist faith because it won't be necessary any longer. And so therefore, when the communist faith isn't taking over, guess what they're going to have to do? They're going to have to get rid of religion. This number 24 is kind of detailed and boring. I thought about skipping it. 24. How do communists differ from socialists? And here's how it gets all technical. Engels gives us the so-called socialists are divided into 3 categories. Reactionary socialists. The first category consists of adherents of a feudal and patriarchal society which has already been destroyed and is still daily being destroyed by big industry and world trade and their creation, bourgeois society. This category concludes from the evils of existing society that feudal and patriarchal society must be restored because it was free of such evils. In one way or another, all their proposals are directed to this end. So in other words, reactionary socialists, those are fascists, by the way, want to go backwards. This category of reactionary socialists, for all their seeming partisanship and their scalding tears for the misery of the proletariat, is nevertheless energetically opposed by the communists for the following reasons. 1, it strives for something which is entirely impossible. Try not to laugh. And by the way, I misspoke a little bit. The fascists were a progressive variant of reactionary socialism, so they were only reactionary kind of in mode, but they were actually progressive too. They were post-liberal, not pre-liberal. These are socialists that want to go back to a pre-capitalist or pre-liberal state. It strives for something which is entirely impossible. In fact, because you really can't go back, it's probably more impossible than the impossibility of communism. 2, it seeks to establish the rule of the aristocracy, the guildmasters, the small producers, and their retinue of absolute feudal monarchs, officials, soldiers, and priests, a society which was, to be sure, free of the evils of present-day society, but which brought it at least as many evils without even offering the oppressed workers the prospect of liberation through a communist revolution. Notice that he talked earlier about how they could all be liberated in different ways, but not through a communist revolution, so that's no good. 3, as soon as the proletariat becomes revolutionary and communist, these reactionary socialists show their true colors by immediately making common cause with the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. 2, bourgeois socialists. The second category, Engels says, consists of adherents of present-day society who have been frightened for its future by the evils to which it necessarily gives rise. What they want, therefore, is to maintain this society while getting rid of the evils which are an inherent part of it. To this end, some propose mere welfare measures, while others come forward with grandiose systems of reform under the pretense of reorganizing society. These are, in fact, intended to preserve the foundations and hence the life of existing society. We could actually say that these are the progressives, or are kind of center-left, the reformers. Communists, he says, must unremittingly struggle against these bourgeois socialists because they work for the enemies of communists and protect the society which communists aim to overthrow. 3, democratic socialists. Finally, the third category consists of democratic socialists who favor some of the same measures the communists advocate as described in question 18. Not part of the transition to communism, however, but as measures which they believe will be sufficient to abolish the misery and evils of present-day society. These democratic socialists are either proletarians who are not yet sufficiently clear about the conditions of the liberation of their class, or they are representatives of the petty bourgeoisie, a class which prior to the achievement of democracy and the socialist measures to which it gives rise has many interests in common with the proletariat. It follows that in moments of action, the communists will have to come to an understanding with these democratic socialists, and in general to follow as far as possible a common policy with them, provided that these socialists do not enter into the service of the ruling bourgeoisie and attack the communists. It is clear that this form of cooperation in action does not exclude the discussion of differences. 25. And this is the last one. What is the attitude of the communists to the other political parties of our time? And we come back to where I said the Communist Manifesto ends, kind of securing that this is in fact the precursor document to the Communist Manifesto. He says this attitude is different in the different countries. In England, France, and Belgium, where the bourgeoisie rules, the communists still have a common interest with the various democratic parties, an interest which is all the greater the more closely the socialistic measures they champion approach the aims of the communists. That is, the more clearly and definitely they support the interests of the proletariat, and the more they depend on the proletariat for support. In England, for example, the working class Chartists are infinitely closer to the communists than the democratic petty bourgeoisie or the so-called radicals. In America, where a democratic constitution has already been established, the communists must make the common cause with the party that will turn this constitution against the bourgeoisie and use it in the interests of the proletariat, that is, with the agrarian national reformers. That party didn't take off, did it? In Switzerland, the radicals, though a very mixed party, are the only group with which the communists can cooperate. And among these radicals, the Vaudois and the Genevese, I don't know, are the most advanced. In Germany, finally, the decisive struggle now on the order of the day is that between the bourgeoisie and the absolute monarchy. Since the communists cannot enter upon the decisive struggle between themselves and the bourgeoisie until the bourgeoisie is in power, it follows that it is the interest of the communists to help the bourgeoisie to power as soon as possible in order to be able to overthrow it. Now, this is all setting the stage for the Nazis. I know that you're saying, James, that's like 80 years later, calm down. No, really. He's saying that basically there's this monarchy in control, therefore the bourgeoisie hasn't taken over, and until they can get a bourgeois government running Germany, there's not going to be the possibility of a communist takeover. So the communists are going to go in league with what amounts to the liberals. They're going to work with them so that those people become the power base. This is what happened finally in the revolution at the end of World War I that established the Weimar Republic. And the Kaisers were overthrown at that point. So as long as the Kaisers, he's arguing, as long as the Kaisers are running Germany, this isn't going to work. We have to get a liberal party in power. So then what's Hitler do? Hitler's like, oh yeah, well, the communists basically run the liberal party. So here it is in the Communist Manifesto, 80 years earlier with Friedrich Engels explaining that the first step for the communists to get communist Germany is going to be to make sure that you have a revolution against the monarchy, and then they're going to betray the people, the liberals that they just worked with. They're going to betray that party and try to establish communism. And that is the scene in which the trials and tribulations of the Nazi experiment actually play out. So this reaction comes at the end of a long communist plot. And then how did that work out? Bad. They did get a communist East Germany, but that was a Soviet satellite, and you did not get a communist West Germany, and you ended up with a utterly destroyed and war-torn country that was basically the heel of the world after the most catastrophic experiment in dealing with this kind of condition that you could possibly imagine. And here we have the Communist Party, before it's even officially launched with its manifesto, just at the advent of the Communist League, explaining that that's their plan. So that tree, born an evil seed of communism, bore fruit in the Nazi experiment. Against the governments, Engels says, therefore, the communists must continually support the radical liberal party, taking care to avoid the self-deceptions of the bourgeoisie and not to fall for the enticing promises of benefits which a victory for the bourgeoisie would allegedly bring to the proletariat. The sole advantages which the proletariat would derive from a bourgeois victory would consist, 1, in various concessions which would facilitate the unification of the proletariat into a closely knit, battle-worthy and organized class, and 2, in the certainty that on the very day the absolute monarchies fall, the struggle between the bourgeoisie and proletariat will start. On the day they help the liberals take power, they turn on them. That's communism. That's their treachery. That's their evil. From that day on, Engels says, the policy of the communists will be the same as it is now in the countries where the bourgeoisie is already in power. And that's the end. There's no more there. The next document actually here, which I'm not going to read because this is long enough, is the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, written in March 1848 in the next year. And the whole of Germany shall be declared a single and indivisible republic. Every German having reached the age of 21 will have the right to vote and to be elected, provided he has not yet been convicted of a criminal offense. Representatives of the people shall receive payment, so that workers too shall be able to become members of the German parliament, on and on and on. Universal arming of the people, by the way, is number 4. But this is this is not the document that I wanted to read. We're already at 2.5 hours, so it's a good place to stop. This is the Principles of Communism, which originally began its life document form as the Communist Confession of Faith and went on to become the Communist Manifesto after a rewrite. This was written, the first version was written at the spring of 1847. This was written in the summer of 1847. And in 1848, they published the Communist Manifesto, ending with the infamous line, "Working men of all countries unite." So now you've heard, the basis of the Communist Manifesto. You understand the arguments, all of that stuff in between about the different types of socialists that I just read, point number 24. That's the 3rd chapter, which we skipped. You can get the document and read it for yourself. But the point of these 2 podcasts, this mini-series, was to make you more aware of the thinking and realities of communism. It was to give you a look behind the scenes. I know that the manifesto itself was much more interesting and active in saying, holy crap, look, this is what they think, and we see it in the woke left and we see it in the woke right. This was a much more historical document, but I thought it was very appropriate to introduce, because if we want to be able to stop communism, we have to be able to understand communism. If we want to understand communism, that includes understanding what its fundamental arguments are, what its fundamental complaints are, and how those complaints attach especially to young, idealistic, and frustrated people, so that we don't make the mistakes. And as the mistakes of, we don't let them or don't leave them in a position where they'll fall into the same mistakes that make people communists. That's, I guess, a better way to word it. And then because we're now going through these kind of rapid changes, I don't know how we quantify these, but industrial revolution, very disrupting, electrical revolution, very disrupting in different ways. And then we get to the digital revolution, the social media revolution. And now we're creeping up on this AI revolution. A lot of the same concerns are hitting a lot of people. A lot of stuff is flying around very rapidly, and it's going to be up to us to be able to see how to chart a course through this without succumbing to the various temptations of an authoritarian regime that controls us, on communistic policy, of communism itself as some kind of weird revolt against this that's doomed to fail, or to inspire some goofy reaction. The stakeholder economy, which is a kind of updated 21st century reinvention and implementation of this, learning from and drawing from the lessons of fascism and incorporating them into the communist model. We want to avoid all that, but we have to understand what their thinking was and how it was appealing to people and how it's still appealing to people if we're going to be able to derail all of that. So I hope this presentation has been helpful. I won't keep rambling. If you don't mind, if you have the chance, I greatly appreciate your support here at New Discourses. I guess like this on whatever platform you're listening. If you have the chance, subscribe, tell your friends to subscribe, share it if you can. Let's get the word out. We've got a culture war to win, and it's a complicated thing, and I'm happy to help, and I very much appreciate your support. Thank you for listening.